I'm Avery Collins, 26 years old. The girl who was once seen as the clingy orphan granddaughter in my own family. But right there, during the will reading, when the attorney announced that I was the sole heir to my grandfather's $160 million estate, the room went completely silent. My mother stood up and shouted that there had to be some mistake. Me. Standing in the middle of her glare and my stepfather's cold stare, I could only think of what my grandfather whispered to me before he passed. Don't let anyone steal what you're meant to protect. I just didn't realize that was only the beginning. Because right after that, a woman I had never seen before walked in and declared she was my grandfather's legal wife. Have you ever been dragged into an inheritance war without even realizing you were the target? Share your thoughts in the comments, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and join me in uncovering the truth hidden behind one name: Collins. I didn't walk out of the will reading right after that strange woman showed up. My heart was pounding in my chest, not just from the shock but from a rising fear I couldn't name. It felt like there was something I'd never been told, a piece of memory that had been hidden from me for far too long. But then I remembered the look in my grandfather's eyes during his final days, a look that seemed like it wanted to say something but never could. I knew I had to find out what it was. That night, I returned to the old estate where my grandfather had lived for over 40 years, the place I had called his home since I was a child. Everything was just as he'd left it, from the familiar silver teacup on his desk to the leather notebook he always kept by his bedside. I stepped into his room, still scented faintly with aged wood and the cool sweetness of the peppermint candies he used to suck on when he felt tired. I opened every drawer, every cabinet. Not because I suspected anything specific, but because I needed to understand. I needed to know why he had placed so much trust in me. In the final drawer of the wardrobe, under a pile of old sweaters he never wore anymore, I found a small key tucked inside a worn yellow envelope. On the envelope, in his shaky handwriting, were the words: "If you need to know the truth, open safe number 3. Safe number 3. I stood still for a few seconds, then quickly rolled back the rug beside his desk. Beneath it, under a panel of wood that looked like it had been removed many times before, was a small hidden lock. I slid the key in and turned it. The click was soft, but it made my heart drop. Inside were a bundle of letters tied with red thread, a worn brown leather journal, and a thick stack of company documents stamped with the Collins Tech seal. I sat on the floor, hands trembling as I untied the thread and opened the first letter. Every handwritten line was instantly familiar. It was his handwriting. "Avery, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer with you," one letter began. "I'm not writing these things out of mistrust, but because you deserve to know the truth, unfiltered and unedited." He wrote about my mother, Diane Collins, with a tone of regret and disappointment I never imagined he carried. Growing up, I had only seen his calm, measured demeanor around her. Never a harsh word. But in his letters he revealed that she had once taken hundreds of thousands of dollars from the company's internal fund to cover her personal debts, then blamed the CFO, nearly costing him control of the company back in 2007. He continued, "I gave her chances. Over and over. But every time she went back to Mark, a man I never trusted, not even from the first handshake. They thought I was old, blind, slow. But I saw everything. I lay awake some nights pretending to sleep just to hear them scheme about taking over the company. Their plan was to inherit everything, pass it to Diane, and then put it all in Mark's name. I knew." I set the letter down, my chest swirling with confusion. There are truths that, when heard, make you wish they weren't true. I had always believed my mother was cold, maybe controlling, but never imagined she was capable of trading away honor and trust just to seize power. Yet my grandfather had seen it, and he had prepared for it. I opened the leather-bound journal. The first page bore his familiar message, the one he always told me in person: "Write it down, Avery. What's not written will be forgotten or rewritten." The pages that followed were filled with detailed notes from board meetings, stock movement over the past 3 years, and observations on each board member. He had watched them closely, recorded their behaviors, their shifts, their loyalties, leaving me a roadmap for the very seat he had once held for decades. And then I reached a line that made my throat tighten. He wrote that naming me as heir wasn't just because I had cared for him. Not just because I was the only one left with kindness. It was because he believed I was the only one not corrupted by ambition. Avery doesn't chase. She doesn't wait. She learns, observes, and listens. She's the only part of the future I ever had real hope for in this company. I closed the journal, both hands clenched. I felt lifted up, but also crushed under the weight of everything he had placed on my shoulders. A knock at the door startled me. I stood up and opened it. The woman from earlier, Helen Rivera, was standing there, holding an envelope in one hand and a quiet look in her eyes. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said softly. "But there's something I think Avery should see, before things get worse." I invited her in. The room fell into silence again, but this time it was the silence shared between two women carrying memories, pain, and truths that had never been spoken aloud. "I was his legal wife," Helen began, her voice calm but not cold. "We married secretly in Santa Fe 3 years after your mother passed. He told me then he couldn't make it public. It would have complicated the finances and his will. But he wanted a witness. Someone to protect you, in case anything ever happened." I stood frozen. Everything was clicking into place. A secret marriage. A web of quiet protections he had built around me for years. And now, piece by piece, he had left me the puzzle to reassemble the whole truth. Helen handed me a sealed letter. "This one," he said, "to open only when they started coming after you. And I think that time is now." I held the envelope, a chill running through me. I knew the fight ahead wouldn't just be in courtrooms or board meetings. It would be inside my own bloodline, facing people I had once called family who now wanted to destroy me for power. I opened the letter. The desk lamp lit up the familiar script. I hadn't even had time to fully process what Helen had revealed when the storm hit. 3 days after the will was read, I officially received a legal notice from my mother and Mark. My name was printed at the top of the lawsuit in bold type, like an accusation carved in stone: psychological exploitation of an elderly individual for personal gain. I sat in my office, staring at the pages the private courier had delivered. Every line made my chest tighten. My mother, the woman who once walked me to school every morning, who taught me how to bake my grandfather's favorite plum tart, was now accusing me of deceiving the only person who had ever truly believed in me. Mark didn't show up in meetings. He didn't need to. The media had already done the rest. That afternoon, as I checked my phone to respond to emails, a headline jumped out on my lock screen: "Young engineer accused of manipulating billionaire grandfather. Who's really behind the sudden takeover at Collins Tech?" I clicked it. Every article was the same, painting me as some cold, opportunistic figure who'd wormed her way into an aging man's trust to steal his empire. They dug into my past, resurfacing my decision to drop out of graduate school, originally made to care for my grandfather, and now framing it as part of a long-term plan to seize control. Below each article were thousands of comments. Many called me an ungrateful leech, a parasite living off a dead man's fortune. A few defended me, but even their tone was filled with uncertainty. If she's really innocent, why hasn't she made everything public? I understood. In the eyes of the public, emotion always outpaces logic. And now my image was being shaped by distorted narratives and missing context, fed not by strangers but by my own family. That night, I received a call from the company's deputy general counsel. "Avery," he said, hesitating, "I need to let you know, we just lost 2 major software development contracts. The partners cited internal instability and negative public image. If we don't get ahead of this, more could follow." I didn't respond right away. It felt like someone had sucked the oxygen out of the room. Losing contracts meant losing trust. And in the tech world, losing trust for even a week is enough to bring the whole system down. The stock price began to plummet. Within 72 hours of the media coverage, the company's market value dropped by over $6 million. As I walked through the hallway of the office, I could feel the glances that quickly darted away, the averted eyes as if people were afraid to accidentally meet mine. Some employees didn't even say hello. That feeling twisted something deep inside me. I understood. They were scared. And that fear came from uncertainty, from not knowing whether they would still have a place in this company tomorrow. I stepped into the executive boardroom, a space I had grown familiar with during the years I shadowed my grandfather. Back then, he always left an empty seat next to him so I could observe and learn. Now I sat at the head of the table, but the chair felt colder than ever. One senior board member, Mr. Malcolm Rayner, looked at me through his thick glasses. He had been my grandfather's close friend since their days at Stanford. But today his tone was colder than I'd ever heard. Avery, I'm going to be blunt. What's happening out there is a disaster. The media is attacking, shareholders are losing trust, projects are stalling. We can't just sit by and watch this company collapse over a personal conflict. I lifted my head and looked straight at him. I understand the situation, Mr. Rayner. But I didn't create it. The people attacking me, my mother and Mark, are the ones responsible. Another voice cut in. Mrs. Cynthia Blunt, who had once served as CFO under my mother. Do you have proof of that claim? Diane was the most competent financial director this company ever had. Maybe she's just fighting to reclaim fairness. I bit my lip, chest tightening. I knew some in that room were still loyal to my mother, or at least owed her favors. They didn't believe me. Or they didn't yet have enough reason to stand with me. I didn't come here to complain, I said slowly. I came to let you know, I'm not stepping down. And I'll soon release a full set of financial records and evidence tied to this attack. I have nothing to hide. No one spoke. I stood, bowed slightly the way my grandfather always had. Even though my thoughts were tangled, there was one thing I understood clearly. If I didn't hold my ground, no one else could hold it for me. That evening, as I sat quietly by the window in my office, Helen arrived. She carried an old folder stamped in faded blue ink, the company logo faint in the corner. I think it's time you saw this, she said, placing it on the table. It's a copy of the internal investigation report from 2013. He kept it in case things ever got out of control. I opened the folder. The first page read, Detailed Evidence, Unauthorized Fund Transfers from Internal Reserve, Diane Collins and Mark Holden. I flipped through the pages quickly, my hands slowly tightening. The handwriting, the numbers, the signatures, the transaction IDs, all matched what my grandfather had mentioned in his letters. And then I understood. This wasn't just a battle to stay CEO. This was a battle to protect the honor and legacy my grandfather had safeguarded his entire life. And they were trying to destroy it by any means necessary. I sat alone in my grandfather's old office. The dark wood-paneled walls still carried the scent of aged pine and the faint sweetness of peppermint from the candy jar he always kept on the desk. Outside, the weak autumn sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting the shadows of swaying branches onto the wool carpet. The room felt untouched, like he had just stepped out a few minutes ago. But I knew if I wanted to protect everything he'd left behind, I had to start from here. I contacted Harold Dean, the old friend my grandfather always called the final watchman. Harold was a retired attorney, his white hair thin, his frame lean but upright. When I called him, he didn't ask anything except one sentence. Is it time? I nodded when we met in the small library inside the estate. They're dragging the entire company into a mess, I said, my voice hoarse from lack of sleep. And I need to know, did Grandpa hide anything else for emergencies? Harold opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a set of worn keys. There's something he left in his personal safe on the 6th floor, he said slowly. An amendment to the will. Not to reassign assets, but as a safeguard in case you were removed from the company through manipulation. We went up to the 6th floor where my grandfather's executive office had once been. The room had been sealed since his passing, double-locked, accessible only to top-level executives. I used my keycard to unlock the door, then inserted the old-fashioned key Harold had brought into the wall safe hidden behind a framed oil painting. Inside, along with a sealed envelope, was a notarized legal document stating, in the event that the legal heir, Avery Collins, is removed from the CEO position by unlawful or improper means, all shares personally owned by Mr. Whitmore shall be transferred to the Whitmore Children's Trust, a non-profit scholarship and research foundation for underprivileged children. I looked at the notarization stamp. The signing date was just 6 months before his death. He saw this coming, Harold murmured. If they try to push you out with tricks, they'll get nothing. In fact, they'll lose everything. I tightened my grip on the file. My breath was shallow. I wasn't just an heir anymore. I was the final barrier protecting everything he had built. I chose not to tell anyone about the second will. What I needed now wasn't a passive shield, but a proactive weapon. I needed to see what they were doing behind my back. That night, when the building had emptied, I returned to the 5th-floor boardroom, where strategy meetings were usually held. I brought with me a small hidden camera, discreetly placed in the base of a display lamp, angled directly at the seats where Mark and his closest allies usually sat. I knew I was taking a risk. But I also knew that if I did nothing, I'd have no chance to fight back when they made their move. 3 days later, on a Friday evening, my phone buzzed with a motion alert. Someone was in the boardroom. I opened the live feed immediately. On the black and white screen, I saw Mark sitting confidently with one leg crossed over the other. Next to him were 2 board members, Mr. Sherman and Mrs. Louise, both of whom had maintained a neutral stance in public meetings. "We lock this down next week," Mark said clearly. "She's just a kid grandpa lifted out of emotion. No one wants to bet an entire company on feelings." "But what if Avery finds out we're rallying support?" Mrs. Louise asked, cautious. Mark gave a short laugh. "She won't. And if you all back me, I guarantee a 12% share redistribution after I take over. Each of you will have a solid seat in Collins Tech's new future." "What about the old lawyer?" Sherman asked. "Harold Deans Whitmore's guy. He's not to be underestimated." Mark waved it off. "He's got nothing solid. As long as the vote goes through as planned, Avery won't have a voice. And once she's out as CEO, interim control shifts entirely to me." I sat still, numb. Everything I had suspected, from the looks exchanged in meetings to the way the media spun their stories, was now out in the open. They were playing a game without rules. I saved the footage, duplicated it 3 ways. 1 copy went to my encrypted email, 1 printed and sealed, and 1 placed in Harold's secure safe. I knew I had a long road ahead. But now I had something they didn't expect: undeniable proof of an internal plot and bribery. And I was going to use it, at the right time, to bring everything into the light. That morning, the Collins Tech headquarters felt heavy, as if the walls themselves sensed what was coming. Word about the emergency board meeting had been circulating internally for 2 days, though nothing had been officially announced. The invite said nothing more than attendance required for high-level leadership strategy discussion. But I knew exactly what this was. It was the move Mark and my mother had been quietly building toward. Their patience had run out. I stepped into the 10th floor boardroom, the very place where my grandfather had sat hundreds of times to make life-altering decisions for the company. The long table was draped in dark green velvet. Every chair on both sides was filled. Most were longtime board members, familiar faces, but today their eyes seemed to avoid mine. Mark was already standing at the head of the table, the seat that should have been mine. He adjusted his shirt collar, nodded politely to the board, and gave me a faint, calculated smile as I entered. "Hello, Avery," he said, voice slick. "Glad you could make it." I didn't respond. I calmly pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down, steady, unshaken. My heart pounded inside my chest, but my face betrayed nothing. I had prepared for this moment all week. Mark began first, as if performing a well-rehearsed play. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said clearly, "we all loved Mr. Whitmore and want to continue the legacy he left behind. But recent events are threatening the reputation and stability of Collins Tech. The press, the shareholders, the partners, everyone is on edge. And unfortunately, the source of this instability stems from inexperience at the helm." All eyes slowly turned toward me. Mark stepped forward slightly, resting one hand lightly on the table. "With support from several members of this board, we propose reconsidering the current leadership. I don't deny Avery's passion or her intentions, but right now, we need someone with the resilience and experience to steer the company through a critical time." I remained silent. My eyes scanned the room face by face. They looked at me, then back at Mark, as if torn between loyalty and safety. "And who exactly has that experience?" I asked softly but firmly. Mark smiled. "I'm not saying this out of self-interest. But if the board is willing, I'm prepared to serve as interim CEO, at least until we're back on solid ground." The air in the room thickened. I could hear a pen tapping lightly against a notebook, the faint sigh of someone at the far end of the table. "Before any votes are cast," I said slowly, "I think everyone should see a short video." I gave a nod. The projector powered on, casting light onto the large screen at the center of the room. The image appeared. This very room, this very table, but dimly lit, and Mark sitting in the chair I now occupied. His voice rang out clearly over the speakers. "She's just a kid he lifted up out of sentiment. No one wants to bet an entire company on feelings. I'm offering 12% of company shares once control is transferred. Every person in this room will have a long-term seat in the new future of Collins Tech. The room went still. Mark's face went rigid. He stumbled back half a step. That's a cheap edit, he stammered, his voice starting to shake. I lifted my head. Then what about these messages? I placed a stack of printed emails on the table, each page detailing conversations between Mark and board members, complete with timestamps, IP addresses, and content from a secondary account that had been leaked. The messages included proposals to route hidden profits through shell companies to avoid detection. One board member, Mr. Perry, stood up immediately. We were never informed of these details, he said sharply. Mark didn't have time to answer before my mother stood up. Not angry, not flustered. In fact, she was strangely calm, almost gentle. We're not denying there have been misunderstandings and disputes, she said as she pulled a folder from her handbag. But before the board makes any decisions, I'd like to present a critical fact everyone here should know. She drew out a notarized document. This is a legal adoption certificate issued by the state of Arizona, she said. Avery Collins, legally speaking, is not Mr. Whitmore's biological granddaughter. She was adopted as an infant. The room erupted into whispers. I stood frozen. Though I had suspected, though Helen had hinted at it, no one had ever said it to my face, until my mother just did. And according to current inheritance law, she continued, leaving an entire estate to someone with no blood relation must be supported by more than just a standard will. I believe my father's will was manipulated during his final days. I rose from my chair. Both hands on the table, steady. My voice was low and unwavering. So the truth finally comes out, I said, looking straight at her. I may not be his blood, but I was the one by his side at the end. The one he trusted. And the only person in this room who didn't have to trade company shares to earn this seat. I turned to the board. You have every right to question me. But before you vote, ask yourselves this. Do you want to entrust Collins Tech to someone who tried to buy their way into power? Or to someone who's willing to risk her own name to protect the integrity of this company? The room fell into complete silence. I met each gaze, watched the slow nods, the eyes that no longer looked away. I didn't know how the vote would turn out. But one thing was certain, I hadn't backed down. And now the truth wasn't in their hands anymore. It was in the light. That night after the stormy meeting, I didn't go home. I drove aimlessly through the city as the lights came on, every street stretching endlessly ahead. My mind was blank, but my heart felt heavy. Even though I had prepared for it, even though I had long suspected, hearing my own mother announce that truth in front of the entire board felt like having the roots of my identity ripped from the ground. I stopped in front of a small lakefront house, Helen's home. Warm light glowed from the kitchen window, a quiet contrast to everything I had just endured. She opened the door before I could knock. I figured you'd come tonight. I didn't say a word, just stepped inside. The house was peaceful, filled with the scent of herbal tea and toasted bread. Helen pulled out a chair by the fireplace and handed me a hot cup of tea. I held it like it was the only thing keeping me from falling apart. I need to know, I said, my voice rough. Everything. If I'm not his blood, then why did he take me in? And why didn't he ever tell me? Helen sat across from me, slowly opening a drawer beneath the tea table. She took out an old brown leather notebook. The corners were worn, the pages yellowed, but the handwriting was steady and familiar. It was his. This is from his final months, she said softly. He wrote it just for you. Told me only to give it to you when the time was right. I flipped to the first page. My heart clenched. Avery, an unexpected gift in a life full of regret. I kept reading. Every line, every word felt like a sharp blade slicing through the memories I had once believed were unshakable. You are not Diane's biological daughter and not my granddaughter in the traditional sense. But you are the flesh and blood of my son, the one I once believed would never be capable of being a father. Years ago, he fell in love with a woman living in a shelter. She was thin, quiet, but her eyes always held fire. When he found out she was pregnant, he panicked and ran. But she didn't. She gave birth, then left the child at my doorstep on a winter night, along with a note that simply read, "Please give this girl a chance." I looked up at Helen, my throat tightening. Is it true? I asked, barely recognizing my own voice. She nodded, her eyes soft, like a blanket being laid gently over the storm inside me. He kept it from you because he didn't want you to carry that pain. But he never once saw you as an outsider. From the first moment he looked at you, he called you what remained of what he once lost. I bowed my head, tears rolling down my face. Not from pain, but from the quiet realization that he had never let me feel abandoned, even though I hadn't been born into this family the way everyone assumed. I kept reading. Diane never accepted you. She always saw you as a burden I brought home, something shameful to be hidden. But you grew up, never asking, never fighting. You simply watched, learned, and gave love without expecting it in return. That's something even blood can't always do. The next page was a copy of a birth certificate. Father, Elliot Whitmore. Mother, Isabel Grace, no listed residence. I had never heard that name before, yet it appeared before me like a figure distant and strange but eerily familiar. Suddenly I felt as if I were standing between two worlds. One I had always believed to be my roots and another more uncertain but perhaps the real beginning. I once asked him, Helen said after a pause, if he feared the consequences if the truth ever came out. He laughed and said, if justice lies in blood, then many wicked men would still wear crowns. But if it lies in action and love, then Avery will never lose her place in my heart. I closed the notebook, a quiet ache rising in me, sadness, yes, but also peace. Even if the truth could cost me my legal standing in some people's eyes, I knew I hadn't lost what mattered most, the reason he chose me. I'm scared, I whispered, scared that if this goes to court I'll have no rights left. Helen reached over and held my hand. Don't be afraid. Those who use the law to destroy can steal a signature, but they can't take what he planted in you, trust. Outside the window, the first raindrops of the season began to fall quietly. Helen's little house stayed warm, still the only safe place I had left. I sat there for a long time saying nothing more, just holding on to that journal, like I was holding the last words he ever meant for me to hear. A confirmation that I wasn't just chosen. I was loved. And that love was never accidental. I stood backstage of the Grand Hall where the press conference was about to begin. On the main platform, a deep blue backdrop bearing the Collins Tech logo had been set up, simple but dignified. The lighting had been adjusted to feel warm but not flashy. The seats were filled, press, market analysts, shareholders, and some familiar faces from the tech industry. Everyone waited in silence. I could hear cameras clicking into place, quiet whispers from people setting up their recordings, and the sound of my own heart pounding in my chest. I looked out at Helen in the front row. She nodded at me, eyes narrowing slightly as if to say, "You've got this." A moment later, Harold Dean stepped up beside me and placed a steady hand on my shoulder. "Avery, don't think of this as a defense," he said quietly. "You're not defending. You're just telling the truth. And the truth doesn't need permission to be heard." I nodded and stepped out into the light. "Thank you all for being here today," I began, my voice steady, slow but clear. "I didn't come here to protect a title. I came to clarify what too many have twisted these past few weeks." I paused for a few seconds, looking out over the crowd. Recorders clicked on. Cameras followed my every move. "Yes," I continued, "it's true, just as many have said, I'm not Mr. Whitmore's biological granddaughter. I wasn't born into his bloodline. I was chosen. And I was loved." There were murmurs. But I didn't look away. I didn't lower my eyes. He brought me home when I couldn't even speak yet. He didn't owe me anything. But he raised me, taught me, shaped me day by day the way a father shapes a daughter. While other kids played with dolls, I was taking notes during internal finance meetings. When people called me a misfit, he called me the only seed growing straight in a garden full of chaos. And he believed I understood this company better than anyone. I turned to the large screen. And now I'll let him say the rest. The video played. My grandfather appeared, seated in his old leather armchair in his familiar office. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, his gaze unwavering. His voice came through slow, a little hoarse but clear. "If you're watching this, Avery, I'm probably no longer around. But I want the world to know, you are the one I chose. Not because of blood, but because you lived, loved, and understood Collins Industries the way its soul deserved to be protected. I didn't leave you a legacy because I had to. I left it because I trusted you fully. The room fell silent. I could hear deep breaths. The eyes of many softened. I looked down at the shareholders, those who had quietly pulled their support, not watching with suspicion now, but with a look that suggested something had finally been unaudit. The screen changed again. My grandfather placed a hand on a folder with my name on it. His voice softened but remained firm. They'll say you don't belong. That you're just a child who wandered into a family you weren't born into. But remember, no one belongs anywhere until they truly protect it. And you, Avery, have protected what I valued more than the fortune, my ideals. The video ended. I looked out and saw a reporter in the right section with his hand over his heart, his eyes rimmed red. He raised his hand gently. "Miss Collins," he asked, "after everything, do you still plan to continue as CEO? Even knowing that some in the public might never fully accept you?" I smiled, not rushing to answer. Then I replied one word at a time. "Collins Tech isn't a place I came to prove anything. This is my home. I'm staying, not to hold on to a title, but to protect what my grandfather believed I could do. Keep this company's soul from being swept away by greed and ambition." Another reporter jumped in. "What will you do to regain market trust?" "I won't promise to please everyone," I said. "But I will be transparent. I'll release the full operational records from the past 3 years. I'll also establish an independent oversight board nominated by shareholders themselves. And if 6 months from now the results don't show real recovery, I'll step down and hand over the role to someone more deserving. Not for power but for Collins Tech." Applause broke out, not loud, not thunderous, but deep, steady. The kind of applause from people who once doubted but were beginning to believe again. That night, back at my office, my assistant handed me the press roundup. My name was on the front page of 3 major business papers. One headline made me pause in silence. "Avery Collins, the heir without blood, but with all the spirit of Collins Tech." I said nothing. I just touched the page lightly as if thanking my grandfather, not just for choosing me but for teaching me that sometimes, the truth doesn't have to shout. It only needs to be spoken at the right time. And heard with the heart. Just a few days after the press conference, as the stock finally began to climb again and the investment team was restarting talks with 2 international partners, we were hit by an entirely different crisis. That evening, as I was reviewing market recovery plans at the office, my IT assistant called my internal line, his voice urgent. "Avery, we've detected irregularities in the payment system. Domestic transactions are being suspended. Most payments are being automatically canceled or blocked midway, and we've just recorded data loss from the main server." I immediately called the entire tech team into the strategy room on the 9th floor. Preliminary reports showed that our 3-layer encrypted cash flow management system had been breached. The entire transaction history from the past 48 hours had been wiped, and dozens of orders had been returned or forcefully canceled. The finance team estimated damages at more than $3 million, just in the first week. The room turned chaotic. I stood silently as a cold chill crept through my chest. No one inside this company had the capability to penetrate that deep, unless someone on the outside had been given incredibly detailed instructions. Only one name came to mind: Diane. 4 years she had served in senior financial roles and had access to nearly every layer of the old system. Though the company had since upgraded multiple security tiers, the foundational structure still carried remnants, if someone was patient enough to dig. I went to Helen that same night. She opened the door with a calm expression as if she had been expecting me. "You think she did it?" she asked. Then, without waiting for an answer, she pulled out her phone and launched a specialized encryption software. "I once helped a military unit trace an international breach in under 8 hours. With Collins' system, I think we'll need 6. Helen grabbed her laptop and connected directly to the internal network using my emergency access credentials. On the screen, lines of code raced by, layer after layer of data unlocking. Her eyes narrowed with focus, her fingers moved so fast I couldn't keep up. "They used a triple-layer VPN rerouting from Norway to Panama, then back to New Jersey," she said. "But the final IP address is in-state." I stepped closer. "Where exactly?" Helen typed a few more commands, then paused, her expression darkening. "It's at the satellite office of our secondary tech contractor, but the device accessing it doesn't belong to them." A MAC address and device ID flashed on the screen. Helen enlarged the view, then entered another command quickly. This device was temporarily registered under an employee's name. Mark Holden. I froze. My hand on the chair tightened until my knuckles turned white. Helen continued, voice sharp. He used a company-issued device to create an intermediate attack path, making it look like a system error. I immediately called Harold, transferring all the logs and documentation. By the next morning, the Kings County District Attorney's Office issued an emergency subpoena. A joint task force from the Cybercrime Division and federal agents executed a search warrant at Mark's former office, a location he still used as his private workspace despite having been stripped of his title. At 9 a.m., just as Mark stepped into the building, gray coat, tie perfectly straight, his usual smug confidence in place, 3 FBI agents walked up, handed him an arrest warrant and placed him in custody. I watched from an upper floor through the glass pane, my heart unmoved. He tried to resist, muttering that he was being framed, but the agents seized his personal laptop, phone, and several storage devices from the briefcase he carried. A technician from our IT team reported back after pulling the data. We found pre-written attack scripts, along with wire instructions to offshore personal accounts in the Cayman Islands. It's nearly impossible for him to deny this. Helen stood beside me, exhaling quietly. Mark always thought he was clever enough to bend the rules. But he underestimated your patience. I nodded. But even as everyone focused on damage control, one question spun in my mind like a blade. Where was Diane? I called the number she used, no longer in service. I reached out to her former assistant. No one knew anything. Her social media, her email accounts, completely silent. By late afternoon, the police sent out an internal alert. Diane Collins had left the state by car the night before. Traffic cams picked up her license plate on the interstate heading toward New Mexico. Her phone was found discarded at a gas station 60 miles from the border. Harold read the report, folded the paper, and spoke in a low voice. She's not planning to take responsibility. But no matter how far she runs, she can't outrun herself. I didn't respond. I simply walked toward the window, looking out over the city below. The city that had nearly collapsed under the weight of the people I once called family. But in that moment, I didn't feel angry anymore. There was only one thing left I knew I had to protect at all costs. This company, the legacy my grandfather devoted his life to, and the one I was just beginning to learn how to defend with my own hands. I entered the boardroom on a quiet Monday morning, sunlight pouring softly through the tall glass panels. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't afraid. I didn't walk in bracing for attacks. I didn't feel like the room was waiting for me to fall. Instead, I brought with me a sense of clarity, as if every scar had closed, leaving behind something solid and unshakable. One by one, the board members entered. A few greeted me with looks different from the ones I'd seen before. No longer skeptical, just expectant. They wanted to see what I would do now that everything had changed. I nodded to each of them and took the seat that had belonged to my grandfather for nearly 4 decades. I opened the binder in front of me, placing both hands on the walnut table faded slightly by time. Before we begin our discussions on restructuring leadership and reallocating shares following recent events, I said, eyes steady, I want to share something more important than any number. The room went silent. I gently pulled the microphone toward me. Collins Industries was not built solely on technology, but on one core principle: using knowledge to change lives. That's what my grandfather told me in every private meeting. Not profit. Not market cap. Opportunity. I paused, not for effect but to give the words room to land. I've brought a proposal today, I continued, not for appearances, but to carry out his final wish, and what I now consider my lifelong mission. I clicked the first slide on the screen behind me. The Legacy Program, a technology scholarship fund for underprivileged youth, especially those pushed to the margins by lack of resources or overlooked by the system. Each year, Collins will allocate 2% of net profits to cover full tuition, devices, hands-on training programs, and, most importantly, paid internships right here at our company. I glanced around the room. A few brows furrowed in thought, but most were poring over the printed documents I had distributed, outlining the timeline, the budget, and the long-term impact of the initiative. None of us started from zero, I said softly. Not even me. I was once a child with no blood relatives, raised in a family where love came with conditions. But my grandfather gave me a chance, not just to learn but to be trusted. Now it's my turn to do that for someone else. Rayner, one of the senior board members, raised his hand gently and spoke slowly. Avery, he said, I used to oppose your presence in this seat. I won't hide that. But today, looking at this proposal, I have no doubt left. You didn't just come to take over. You came to lead. I nodded slightly, overwhelmed by a feeling I couldn't describe. A younger board member, Charlotte Dunn, the head of human resources, continued. If the board approves, I propose we create an internal training branch to tie the legacy program directly to our existing tech teams. This isn't just about education, it's a clear career path. We should begin in the areas most economically impacted across the state, Mr. Holloway added. That's where a tech scholarship could change an entire generation. I sat silently, listening to them discuss, adjust, contribute. No one argued out of self-interest. No one questioned the bloodline I carried. Everyone focused on one thing, doing what was right. Finally, Mr. Harold, who had quietly observed the entire meeting from the back, stood up, nodded slightly and said, It's time for Collins Industries to no longer be the legacy of one man, but of a new generation that inherits both trust and responsibility. The board voted. Hands raised one by one. Heads nodded in agreement. Signature after signature appeared on the resolution. As the final signature was laid down, Charlotte looked at me and smiled. From this day forward, Avery, you are the full CEO. Not because it was handed to you, but because you've earned our trust. I didn't speak. I simply tightened the old leather bracelet my grandfather once gave me, still resting on my left wrist like a quiet reminder. Legacy isn't something inherited. It's something carried forward through action. And now I had truly begun my journey. 1 year later, I stood on the main stage at the National Tech Conference in Seattle, in front of over 3,000 attendees and tens of thousands watching online. The lights shone down on me, but I didn't feel exposed. On the contrary, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be, at exactly the right time. The large screen behind me lit up with the first images. An old room where my grandfather once sat reading the paper, a modest wooden desk scattered with rough tech sketches, and finally a young girl with light brown hair jotting notes beside him. That's me, I began, my voice calm but full of emotion. I was 12 years old. I didn't know what power meant, let alone what it meant to be an heir. All I knew was that my grandfather loved his work the way someone loves a forest they've spent a lifetime tending. And he didn't teach me with words. He taught me by letting me witness how deeply he cared about every detail, every person, every failure, and every small hope he planted in the darkest seasons. The hall was silent. A few people lowered their heads. I saw Helen sitting in the front row, wearing a soft teal dress, eyes never leaving me. Her eyes were red but gleamed with pride. I continued, each word coming from a place deep within me. A year ago, I didn't think I'd be standing here. I lived through months where every belief I had was torn apart. I was betrayed by the people I once called family. I was doubted, slandered, stripped of my title, and finally forced to choose: bow down and walk away, or stand up and protect what I believed in. I chose to stand. Not because I was braver than anyone else, but because I carried the words my grandfather left behind. If you don't protect it, no one will. I paused, glancing to the left of the stage. His portrait stood framed in oak, his face radiant under soft light, with the words I had personally engraved beneath. Legacy isn't built by blood, but by belief. I turned back to the audience, my heart settling into the weight of memory. I'm not his biological granddaughter. That truth has been made public and I don't run from it. But I am the one he chose. And I believe that sometimes the most precious thing we leave behind isn't wealth. It's who we trusted enough to carry our dream forward. And I know I was chosen not because I was perfect, but because he saw that I would protect what he started. I stepped forward, gently holding the old leather bracelet he once wore, the one I'd kept on me every day for the past year. Today, I don't stand here to talk about victory. I stand to remind us all that one person's dream, if carried forward the right way, can become the legacy of an entire community. I bowed slightly toward Helen, then turned to the audience. And if I may ask to call someone family today, then let it be the woman who always protected the truth, who gave me strength, and who sacrificed her youth to keep one man's soul intact. Let me finally say out loud before everyone here, Grandma. Helen covered her mouth as tears ran down her cheeks. The entire hall fell silent, then erupted into applause, not loud, not formal, but deeply heartfelt. I nodded, took a deep breath, and closed my speech with the exact words my grandfather wrote in his final letter to me. You don't need to share blood to belong to something. You only need to carry enough belief, and never let it be taken from you. I walked off the stage as the soft evening lights glowed from the rafters. No one in the audience stood up right away. They stayed in their seats, quiet, as if still listening to the echo of a story. Not the story of a CEO, but the journey of a soul finding where it belongs, through loyalty, through pain, and through unconditional love. And I knew right then I wasn't just a successor. I was living the dream my grandfather had once started, in the most honest way possible, with my heart. I don't know what lingers in your mind after hearing this story through to the end. Maybe it's injustice. Maybe it's hope. But if there's one thing I want to leave with you, it's this. Sometimes what defines a family isn't a shared last name on paper. It's who held your hand when you were at your weakest, who believed in you when the whole world turned away. I once didn't know where I belonged. I was denied by my own mother. I believed I was just a shadow on the edge of an empire. But because of the unconditional love of a man who didn't choose me by blood, but by heart, I learned how to stand up and rewrite my fate. But what about you? If you learned that you weren't connected by blood, but you carried someone's belief, would you still choose to keep going? Leave a comment and tell me. I'd love to hear from you. And if you find meaning in stories about family, not just the one we're born into, but the one where we find ourselves, subscribe to the channel and stay with me through the journeys ahead. Because your life, my life, all our lives, always have a story to tell. And the ones told from the heart will always reach the heart.